So today we're beginning a brand new message series called Rescue Story, and we're going to be going through the book of Daniel chapter by chapter, verse by verse, looking at it and seeing how God used it. And this is an awesome book of the Bible. This is actually a book of the Bible. All of the Bible has an immense amount of archaeological and historical support. This is one of the most supported in the Bible. It's about as airtight as it can get. There's just thousands of different pieces of evidence across the globe supporting the narrative in the book of Daniel, which is fascinating. And I want to give you just some heads up with it to begin with. First of all, I'll mention it's got 12 chapters in it, and the first 6 of those chapters are going to be narrative. That means they're going to tell us a story. They're going to tell us a story of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are probably the names you've heard for them in the past. And then once we get past those first 6 chapters, the second 6 chapters that we encounter are actually going to be prophetic visions that Daniel has. Some of those relate back to what's already happened in the narrative, but we're going to go through those. And it's fascinating because this is not only going to tell us the story of how God rescued the people of Israel who were captive in Babylon at that point back then, but it's actually going to talk about how he rescues us and how he ultimately brings that together through the second coming of Christ. So a lot of big themes that run through this book, a lot of prophetic things that are really important that God is foretelling, in many cases, thousands of years before they ever occur. Now, before I go into the story, I just want to share a brief personal story with you guys. Here, I would say about 14 years ago, I was going to Boise Bible College. That's BBC that Pam mentioned, and my wife and I both attended there, though she wasn't going there at that point. And we had this opportunity to go serve with a refugee agency there in Boise, and they helped. They were a Christian organization that helped refugees that were coming to the country settle in and figure out how to become American citizens. And I have to say, I'm really sympathetic for people who are in that position. I mean, all these guys went through the legal immigration process, but basically the way it works is you come here, you probably don't know a word of English, but you come here, and in the case of the guys I worked with, I started with 2 guys from Iraq, and by the time I was done, I had half a dozen guys from Iraq. But by the time they came here, they're dropped off here, and they have 6 months in a brand new country to learn the language, get a job, and be able to support themselves financially. Can you imagine if I went and dropped you off in China or in the Philippines or something like that and said, hey, you got 6 months, better figure it out? That would be a tough one. And so serving with them, we did a lot of stuff with them. They were in our house for Easter and Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that. We wanted to help them learn the culture. More than anything, I wanted to share with them who Jesus was. And these guys were all Islamic in their background, but I have great, deep friendships that came out of it. One funny story, in the first week or 2 that I was serving, one of the guys I was working with, super nice guy, but he was looking for a job. And so we had to go out, even though he could barely speak any English. We were going from place to place to place in Boise. Every restaurant we could hit, every movie theater, on down the list, we were dropping off job applications because this guy has to have work and has to be self-supporting in 6 months. And so he had some English classes that were provided for him, but he had to be working at it. And while we were there, we were really working on his English because it was pretty rough to begin with. And I remember we spent several hours dropping off applications. I helped him interact with people, tried to coach him on how you're supposed to do that in America, because it's a little different than Iraq, as you might guess. And we finally stopped at one point, and I said, let me buy you lunch. And so we went to Panda Express and got in there, and there was a line in front of us, and in that line, there were 3 or 4 different women, professionally dressed, must have been on their lunch break, that were there waiting to get food. And we got in there, and I stepped to the back of the line, and this guy looked at me, and he was like, he nodded ahead, and he went and he started to push them aside and go get in line in front of them. And I was like, oh, hold on here. And it's interesting because to us, that's like a shocking thing. Of course, you wouldn't do that. But in Islamic cultures, typically, and in Iraq this is the case, men outrank women. And so, ladies, if you're in line and a man wants to be in front of you, deal with it. And that was the way it worked. And so I had to give some cultural training to him in this case. It wasn't that he was an evil guy or that he hated women or something like that. He just thought, this is the way society works. So I want to be in front of the line. There's only 4 ladies there. We can cut. We can get in front of them. And so I had to stop him. And then later we had conversations about him. And I had to teach him. I was trying to get him to get this phrase. Okay, in America, we say ladies first. We open the door for ladies and say ladies first. And it was funny because a few weeks later, I was back at the refugee agency. And I was there with him, and he had a female case officer who was working with him, and there had been some struggles there, again, because of the dynamics between genders in different cultures. And she had come, in the past, had some challenges, but he went and opened the door for her, and he said, ladies first. And she looked at him like, what on earth has happened to you? And so it was neat to see the transformation. Now, all that to say, it's fascinating to think about being transplanted in a new culture and what that would involve. But I want to suggest to you today, I think many of us are living in a more and more foreign culture in the very place that we live. Do you guys resonate with that at all? There's some things that have happened in the last decade or so that don't seem normal. Well, that's exactly what's going on in our passage today. We have this group of young men that are exiled, and we'll talk a little bit later about what that means, but they're taken from their home nation of Israel, and they're exported off to Babylon. And in Babylon, there's a whole different culture with all different rules, and they're having to figure out, how do I survive in a place like that, and how do I do it and still honor my God and still follow him? And I want to suggest to you, the lessons that we are going to learn in the book of Daniel are increasingly relevant to us in America. Most sociologists are in agreement at this point that America has now become a post-Christian society. Right now, there's somewhere between 50 and 60%, but we're nearing down below 50% of Americans who even claim to be Christian. And if you ask a few litmus tests to see whether or not there really are Christian, because of course many people claim to be Christian, you probably noticed this, many people claim to be Christian, but how many people who claim it actually are? How many of them actually do Christian things and live in a Christian way? So I'll just say up front, if you change that question, and if Americans are asked, how many of you attend religious services twice a month? And admittedly, you could come to church and not be Christian at all, but at least it implies a level of dedication. When you change the question from, are you a Christian, to, do you attend 2 religious services a month, suddenly the numbers drop to about 24% of Americans. Now, mind you, that's of those who attend any religious service. So that includes Muslims, Hindus, and on down the list, all the other world religions that might be represented here. So it would be even a small percentage who are actually practicing Christians, who are living it out in some way like that. Now, I say that to say we need to be ready for a culture that's changing, and Daniel is going to teach us some principles about that today. Now, before we deep dive into our passage and start to break that down, I think it's really important with a book like Daniel to understand some of the history that's going on in this book, because there's a lot here, and I'll say I really had to restrain myself for what I'm about to explain, because I'm a history nerd, and so I spent like 10 hours last week reading on this, but I'll try to restrain myself. But there's some really important stuff that we won't understand this passage fully unless we have it. So I've got a timeline up here, and I don't want you to get too terribly distracted by that, but it's got some big principles that we want to talk about. First of all, it's important for us to realize that at one point there was a unified kingdom of Israel that was ruled by just one king, and that's clear back under the rule of King Saul. He was the first king of a united nation of Israel, and so Saul plays that role after the time of the judges, and that's around the 900s BC, and eventually Saul loses his throne to David, and David has a son named Solomon, who he then passes his throne off to. Solomon, who's said to have been one of the wisest men who have ever lived on earth, and Solomon in his own life could be wise at times, but it turns out with his kids there were some issues. Solomon hands off his throne and allows his son to succeed him, and his son decides, all of the godly counsel that my dad's officials are giving me, I'm going to ignore that, and I'm going to do things my way. And so, as a result of that, the kingdom of Israel is then split into 2 chunks. There's a northern kingdom that we often refer to as Israel in that time frame, and there's a southern kingdom that we refer to as Judah. Now, the northern kingdom didn't have the temple in it, and they were worried about their people having to go down south every year and go down there to be part of that religious practice. So they created out of thin air their own religious system and mixed the worship of Yahweh with the worship of pagan idols. That led to some bad places. In the south, they continued to follow that. And many historians point out that if you were really devout about following Yahweh, well, then you probably would immigrate down south. And if you were really big on, I want that whole idolatry thing, well, then you could go up north and live there. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel, in the course of its history, never had one good king. Every king they had hated God, wanted nothing to do with him. And so by the year 722 BC, God sends the Assyrian army into Israel. He gives prophets warning about this in advance, and they don't listen to it at all because they don't want to hear anything God has to say. But in the year 722, Assyria comes, and by the year 721, the whole northern kingdom of Israel doesn't exist anymore. It's wiped out. There are still people there, but there's nothing resembling what they were before, and they don't have the political autonomy that they once had. And that leaves us in a weird spot where the whole nation of Israel is summarized in this southern nation of Judah. And from this time forward, Judah and the word Israel are often just used interchangeably, but it's always a reference to this southern kingdom. And it's that kingdom that we're talking about today. They had several kings in that kingdom. Some of them, like King Hezekiah, were quite good. They were righteous. They actually drew the people towards God. And others did not do that as much. And that's really the kind of king that we're going to be talking about today. There was a king by the name of Jehoiakim, who was the ruler of Judah. And Jehoiakim was famous because as a ruler, he and his son, Jehoiachin, It's that confusing chin and kin at the end of it there. But he and his son were ruthless. They would go out, and if somebody else had a wife that was pretty that they wanted to marry, they'd find a way for that guy to have an accident. They'd kill him, and they'd take their wife. Or if somebody else had land that they liked, and they thought, boy, I'd really like to have that property, then they would go and make sure that guy had an accident, and they would take that property from them. And so there was utter corruption in the society as a whole. Murder and crime and theft were rampant. That's not familiar, though, right? And all of these things were going wrong. And on top of that, morally, the nation of Israel was in utter decline. Israel had been ignoring God for so long. They'd been following pagan practices of worship, and they were replacing the worship of Yahweh with the worship of other gods. And we talked about this a little bit a while ago in our study of Lamentations, which takes place a little later than our passage today is going to. But some common practices, just to give you some context for how morally declined the society was. It was a commonplace thing for parents in that nation to go and to worship in pagan temples. And the common practice in these pagan temples were things like ritualized prostitution. And so you would go, or your wife would go to this temple, and they would pay money, and then they would tell you whether you were going to have heterosexual or homosexual sex with one of the prostitutes, and you would go to worship your god by doing that. And many parents, if you really loved those pagan gods, then you would take your young teens when they were around 14 years old, and you would donate them to that temple. And say, okay, my child now gets to be one of the temple prostitutes, and they would be the object of that terrible evil. And so that was a problem. And then on top of that, a common practice that God is enraged about, and we can read this through prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah and prophets before them, is that the people of Israel were worshiping a Babylonian god, and we're going to hear more about Babylon in a minute, a Babylonian god by the name of Molech or Marduk. And they would take their infant children, and what they were told is, unless you kill this child, God won't allow your crops to grow, He won't allow your family to prosper, nothing will work out well for you. And they would take their newborn babies, they would heat up a statue of Molech until it was red hot. And again, you can find archaeological evidence for this, I'm not making this up. They would take him and set their baby in the arms of Molech to be incinerated. And they called that worshiping God. Needless to say, God is angry about that. Now, one other element of the sin of Israel that is strangely relevant to the chronology of what we hear is that through the prophets, and actually clear back even in the book of Leviticus, written by Moses hundreds of years before, we see that God warns the people of Israel that when their agricultural crops are growing every year, that for 6 years they can grow whatever they want in their fields, take that, give a tithe off of it, but the rest of it they can use for their household. But every 7th year, they were ordered to give rest to the soil. That 7th year, you can't practice growing anything. We let the soil rotate naturally in its own way. And then the added bonus to this was, if you were impoverished in the nation of Israel, or if you were an immigrant in the nation of Israel and didn't have much money, then this one time every 7 years, you got first dibs, and you got to go out into that field. And if there was still some wheat that came up, or still some vegetables that came up, well, then you could go out there and actually harvest that, and have that, and help support your family. So it gave a leg up to the impoverished. Now, at this point in time, for 490 years, the Israelites have not allowed this to happen. They have skipped every single year of Sabbath for the land. And God has been warning things are going to go awry. In fact, in Leviticus, clear back when this is warned about, God says at that point, if you ignore this, if you don't give to the poor and give rest to your land, then I am going to send you off to a foreign land to live there, because there's going to be a Sabbath one way or the other. And here, at this time frame, that's where that's all coming home to roost. The sin, the ignoring of the Sabbath of the land. Now, intriguingly, again, it's been 490 years. If you divide 490 by 7, because every 7th year they were supposed to let the land rest, that leaves you 70 years. The 70-year time frame that these guys are going to be in exile and that Israel is going to lay desolate, it's not a coincidence. God prophetically foretells it ahead of time and says, it's going to be that long before I let you come home. That's the plan. And so we enter this time during the reign of King Jehoiakim. And he is there as the ruler of the nation of Israel. Again, he's deeply morally corrupt. But Nebuchadnezzar, who is then a general in the Babylonian army and is the heir apparent to the Babylonian throne, Nebuchadnezzar comes down, he defeats the Egyptian army at the Battle of Carchemish, destroys them, and on his way back, he stops at the nation of Israel in 605 BC, and he lays siege to it. They were allies with the Egyptians, and so he lays siege to it. Ultimately, they surrender to him, and the king of Israel, Jehoiakim, ultimately agrees to swear allegiance to Babylon and to send tribute to them on a regular basis. And the king of Babylon is really clear. You can keep your throne, you can keep your power, but you answer to me, and if you defy me, we have a big problem. Initially, it seemed like things were okay, although at this time frame when they were conquered, this is when the first group of exiles, the first group of kids that had to leave Israel were sent off, and Daniel and his friends we're going to read about today, they're in that first group, in that first exile. But ultimately, Jehoiakim starts listening to his pagan advisors, and they start saying, dude, you're getting too worked up about this Nebuchadnezzar guy. He's not that big a deal. And by this point, Nebuchadnezzar's father has died, and he's actually taken over on the throne. And so they say, you could take him. It wouldn't be that bad. You got this guy. And he decides to rebel against Babylon. And as a result of that, Babylon comes back again. There's a second siege of Israel. And during the second siege of Israel, Jehoiakim dies, and his son, Jehoiachin, he, for 3 months, rules in Israel until the city crumbles and the Babylonians come in and take over. Nebuchadnezzar takes the son, drags him off to what was called the Hall of Kings. It was like this circus display or a zoo for kings that the king of Babylon had captured. People could come through and look and see all these different kings and mock them and spit at them and look at them. And it was all just to show how powerful the king of Babylon is. And put in his place was a king by the name of Zephaniah. And Zephaniah was the uncle to Jehoiakim, or the Chin, or the brother to Jehoiachin. And he is put in place. He swears as well allegiance to the king of Babylon, says he'll follow him, and as you might guess, he doesn't ultimately hold to that. Now, what's fascinating is that in both cases of each of these kings, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, these prophets that we can see the writings of in our Bible, they give warnings to these men saying, you definitely don't want to cross Babylon. This is God's punishment to us as a nation. We've ignored him long enough. He's allowing this to happen. Don't fight him, because if you do, you're fighting God. That would be a mistake. And yet, they don't ultimately listen to this. Now, Ezekiel, during that second invasion, that second siege, at the end of it, Ezekiel the prophet is actually drug off over to Babylon. So he's going to be in the same place as Daniel after that. But his parting words, and we can see them written in the Bible, he gives this warning to Zephaniah saying, listen, dude, if you defy these guys, they're not just going to come and take over this city. They're going to utterly destroy it. They're going to tear down the walls. They're going to tear down all the buildings. There won't be a temple. It'll all just be gone. It'll be ruined. And not only that, but he adds this fascinating line where he says, not only that, but you will be taken to Babylon, but you will not see it. Now that's interesting. So ultimately, he decides to defy Babylon, yet again, against godly counsel, against the words of God's prophets. And the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes there, lays siege to it in a fury, and they are in a rough spot. In fact, he flees, the king of Israel, Zephaniah, he flees with his family, and they get out about to the border of Jerusalem before the Babylonian soldiers catch them. And when they do, Nebuchadnezzar has a special treat for the king. He takes him, binds him, sits him on his knees, and then binds all of his sons in front of him, of which he had several. And one at a time, he walks down the line, forcing the king to watch, and slits his kids' throats. And then as soon as that's done, he gets a flaming hot poker, and he burns out the king's eyes, so that the last thing he saw, this was totally intentional, the last thing he'll see is his lineage being over, his line being ended. And then he is drug off to go where his nephew is, to the Hall of Kings, to be sat there as a pathetic display in Babylon of how powerful the king of Babylon is. Now again, 3 sieges that occur. By the time that third siege is done, what the prophet said was exactly true. The city is destroyed. All of the walls and fortifications are torn down to where raiders from neighboring lands can come and raid whenever they want to. The temple itself, the central place of worship of God, is annihilated, not one brick standing on another after it's finished. They go through and they burn down the houses of all the nobles. And in each one of these cases, they export several of the prominent kids from the families of the Babylonians, and we'll talk more about that later. But they send them into exile in increasing numbers. And between that and the mass death that Nebuchadnezzar caused and famines that had hit the land, it's estimated by modern historians that the population of the nation of Judah, from the time this whole thing started to the time it ended, reduced by 90%. Imagine that for a second. 9 out of 10 people you know dead in a ditch or hauled off to another country where you'll never see them again. And along with the destruction, all of their granaries, all of their silos, all of their livestock, all of their agricultural implements, all of it was destroyed. Now, as I said before, Lamentations, our previous study we did, it looked at the story of the Israelites as they walked through this valley and tried to figure out what life was about afterwards. But today, we're not going to talk about what happens in Israel. We're going to shift over to what's happening during that contemporary time frame in Babylon. And there's some really interesting lessons, I think, that we can gain from that. So if you have your Bibles today, I want to encourage you to grab them and open them up to Daniel chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, I'll mention to you, we've got a bunch in the seats in front of you. You can grab one of those. If you don't have a Bible, you can even take that Bible home with you if you want to. If you're using that Pew Bible like I am, then we're going to be on page 881 today. So you can feel free to thumb through over to that. And as usual, we're going to break this down into 7 or so sections. We'll read each one. We'll discuss it. And I hope that God will use that to bring it to life for you. I want to take a moment before we get into that to just say another word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I'm sure there were distractions this week that were pulling our attention. And this society definitely wants to choke our attention out between our phones and our electronic devices and network news and social media and everything else. There's 1,000 things that want us to look not at you, but at something else. Lord, I pray during this time our hearts would be focused. And we can make that decision today to keep our attention on you. I just pray you'd move by your Spirit and guide us to that. Whether we're a follower of you or not, let us see you today for who you are. I ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, we're going to start with a brief section. It's going to kind of reiterate some of the details I just gave you, but hopefully what I gave you will help it make more sense. So we'll begin with verses 1 and 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These they carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put the treasures put the treasure house in the treasure of the house of God. So a few things I want to point out. First of all, we're seeing it's King Jehoiakim. We know that from the first exile. First thing, we see Nebuchadnezzar comes. Now, fascinatingly, it's actually during this siege and subsequent to the immediate victory of it that Nebuchadnezzar actually finds out that his father has died. And his father has died back in Babylon. And so he actually leaves that siege early on. He flees over because he wants to make sure and consolidate his power base. He's got 2 brothers that might be having a shot at the throne, and it's sort of a fascinating family dynamic thing. Looking at history, First Service didn't get this little tidbit, but it's funny. So Nebuchadnezzar, the father and king of Babylon, prior to Nebuchadnezzar, he actually had decided that Nebuchadnezzar would be his successor and heir, but then I guess because one of his other sons, his second oldest son, was pestering him, he said he's not heir, but he's equal to his brother in every way. What do you do with that exactly? That sounds like an argument to say you're the king. So Nebuchadnezzar races back to deal with this and leaves the final details of this first siege into his general's hands and his diplomats' hands. But they go and they take several articles from the temple, several of the things used for worship. They take him back and they put him in his pagan god's home. And so Israel is dealing with this first thing. Now, let's go ahead and see what happens next, and we're going to start to understand what's going on with the exiles, verses 3 through 5. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude of every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Okay, so the king sends back a message to one of his lead political leaders and says, I want you to bring a bunch of kids from their home. Now, most scholars agree the typical age range for these exiles would have been between ages 12 and 14. Do we have anybody here in between age 12 and 14 today, right in that age range? Okay, we've got one over here. Now imagine, we got one over here too. So imagine being in these guys' spot. Here you are, you're at home, you're comfortable with your family, and now there's an army here, and they come and take you, and there's no time for goodbyes. They're going to take you, and they're going to drag you off to Babylon. And there's a few different ideas that are behind this. This is a common practice in the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar certainly favored it, but there's a few ideas behind it. Number one, you notice they're going for the brightest, smartest, related to royal family, connected kids that they can get. They're getting the most potential, really the future of the generations of the nation of Israel, and they're taking them over, and those people are then going to serve Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And so whatever intelligence or aptitude or wisdom they had, Nebuchadnezzar will be able to leverage that. So that's one advantage. But the other advantage is that if you're the parents and you're back in Israel and you start to think, I'm getting tired of these Babylonians, I think we ought to go throw a spear in a few of them, then they can say, how much did you like this guy? You might want to think about that. He's here with me. He's not there with you. And we can do the math on that pretty quick, but he might have an accident if you were to defy me, if you go and work that direction. And so there was a threat to the Israelites in the same sense of try to defy me and your kids die. That's where we're at. And yeah, follow me and my leadership, and then I'll let them live. And this is the sort of deal. Now, actually, I think at first, while that's a traumatic event that happens, I think at first we tend to think these kids were hauled off to a prison or something like that. These kids are actually allowed to be in royal quarters. They're given nice clothing. In fact, they're even allowed to eat the food off the king's table. And that might seem confusing. The idea isn't that they sit with the king every night for dinner. By the way, there's several thousand of them that would have been taken just in this first exile. And so somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 3,000 is generally estimated, though it's good to note Nebuchadnezzar would have done this for every nation he conquered. So there would have been a lot of kids in that position. And the food from the king's table, the idea was this is the best food in the country, and it was prepared for the king. And the crazy part is, if you're the king's chef, you don't just walk up to him every day and say, hey, did you want prime rib or did you want lobster today? If you're the chef for the king, you make all of that and you make it as well as you can, and whatever he wants is what he gets, and he better not run out. And literally, Nebuchadnezzar would kill people for offenses as slight as this. So there's a metric ton of food. It's probably some of the best food in the world, and yet there's some issues with it we'll hear about in a minute, that is being prepared for these guys. They're eating super nutritious food, and in concept, they're really effectively going out and going to what's like a grad school. For 3 years, they're going to be trained like crazy on every art of science and literature and technology and agriculture that the Babylonian Empire has, and they're very sophisticated in that, by the way. We'll talk about that a little later. But they're very sophisticated in terms of what they're teaching. They have 3 years to figure it out, and if they can assimilate that information, and if they can carry themselves well and plug in, well, then maybe at the end of that time, they could actually have some role in the kingdom of Babylon that was significant. If not, there are always toilets that need to be cleaned. There's always bricks that need to be laid. And frankly, if they're too much trouble, there's always graves that can be filled. These kids' lives are in danger, and yet if they do well, there is this potential. Follow us, worship with us, do well, and then we'll let you actually have a future here. You can actually have some role. And so they have this 3-year period before they go before the king, and they have to do the best that they can. Now, verses 6 through 7 are going to talk about who these main exiles are, who we're going to focus on. Again, there are thousands of them, but there's 4 that require special attention. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officials gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, you guys heard those names, and again, I bet you've memorized the Babylonian names before, and yet there's something central that we're missing with this, because unlike Daniel and his friends, I'm guessing you guys aren't Hebrew in both Hebrew, or you aren't fluent in both Hebrew and in the Babylonian or Chaldean language. Once you understand that, you'll understand there's more to this than meets the eye. So let's take a moment and talk about each of those names, what they meant in the Hebrew, and then what they mean in the Babylonian, and what's going on behind the scenes. So I got a slide for that. Let's pull it up for Daniel first. So Daniel, his name in the Hebrew, and there's some debate on this, but you're going to find out we're generally in the neighborhood. Some Hebrew scholars debate one way or the other, but in principle, what I'm saying is correct, regardless of the opinion. So Daniel's name in the Hebrew meant God is my judge. So his parents were some of the few devout Jewish people left in that nation. And when they named their kid, they wanted to make sure he knew, however you decide to live your life, just remember, God is your judge. You'll stand before him someday. You'll answer to him. And so for them, they're devout enough. They want him to know this. But the Babylonians hear that, and they don't want Yahweh, the God of the Jews, to have anything to do with these guys' lives. They're claiming possession of them by renaming them to their slaves. They want them to reject that culture and move forward. And so instead, they name him Belteshazzar. And Belteshazzar means the prince of Baal. Baal is one of their most prominent gods, the same one that they're sacrificing those babies to. You can think of it as if he's the prince of the devil. That's his new name. Super flattering, right? This is not just a change of names. This is a change of calling. They're trying to really clearly signal to Daniel, God may have been your judge before, but Baal is now. Follow him. Now, mind you, the Babylonians, this will be important as we go forward, they have a lot of different names for a lot of different gods. They've got more gods than you've got choices of cereal in the grocery store. But that said, they're really trying to reform who these young men are. Let's go to the next one. Okay, for Hananiah, his name, Hananiah means beloved of God. God loves this kid. Their parents wanted him to know God loves you. He values you, and of course they do too. These were good parents who were trying to raise him in the right way. But the Babylonians say, no one's calling you Hananiah anymore. You're Shadrach now. And Shadrach means you were illuminated or illumined by the sun god, one of the pagan gods that they worship. Let's move on from there to the next one. For Mishael, his name sounds similar. It goes from Mishael, which means who is as God, or who's as good as our God is? That's the question that's behind it. So, and his parents are saying, probably in gratitude for this cute little baby boy, like, isn't God awesome that he would do this for me? Who's better than our God is? And yet the Babylonians changed this to Meshach, which means who is like the moon god. Same question, but a pagan god there. Now, I want to point out, just scholars have some arguments about this, but just a fun little tidbit. The moon god of Babylon, there's a lot of carryover and imagery between that and modern-day Islam. The New Testament's really clear that the god behind these pagan deities was actually a demon, that there were supernatural forces behind them. It wasn't God, but it was demonic forces. It's sort of fascinating that there's this carryover, that the crescent moon is the symbol for the moon god in Babylon and is the symbol for Islam today. You can extract from that what you wish to, but it's a fascinating thing. Let's jump to our last person. Azariah, which means the Lord is help. That's what his name means in the Hebrew. His name gets changed to Abednego, which means the servant of Nego. Now, Nego was known as the shining fire god. And if you were to translate his name into Hebrew, as these Jewish young men would have, the common translation would have been the name Lucifer. You guys heard that before? Yes, so a name for the devil. And so he is the servant of the devil. That is his new name. He was the guy who was helped by the Lord, who the Lord was his help. But now we're changing his name, and now he's a servant of Lucifer. And that's the name we've given him instead. So you can see, again, this is about totally changing the trajectory of these young men's lives. These names to us, they might just sound all weird. The Hebrew one's weird, the Babylonian one's weird. What's the difference? But to them, they couldn't help but notice the meaning here and what the implications are. You serve Babylon now. You do not serve Yahweh. The trajectory of your life is different. That's what's being communicated by Babylon in this. Let's continue with verses 8 through 10. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief officials for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men at your age? The king would have my head because of you. Okay, now notice right in the middle there, we'll get more to it in a minute, but notice at verse 9, God had caused. Here we see again, God is in the middle of this. God is sovereign over that. Whatever's happening, he is playing a role in. Now Daniel, it's got to be a tough place. Here he is in this new place. His parents aren't with him, and some of the best-looking, best-tasting, 5-star food on planet Earth is put before him, and yet virtually all of the meat involved in the preparation of that food is meat that was sacrificed to pagan idols. And the Jewish Bible is really clear, we can't eat that. We can't eat meat that was sacrificed to idols like that, and so I can't consume that food. And so Daniel, of all of these thousands of people brought to Babylon, there's only Daniel, and we'll see his friends with him, his 3 friends with him, who are willing to stand up and say, God says that's evil and I can't do it. Now, there's a lot of other options here that Daniel has, but they're not very good ones. Daniel could say, you know what, I'm going to go spit in this king's face. I'm going to go give him the finger and tell him how it is and tell him I'm not eating any of this grub unless he gets me better stuff. How do you suppose that's going to work out? Not very good. He could also go and say, I just need to convince everybody else in Babylon to eat the food I want to eat, and then we'll be okay. But again, not a very practical solution. And so his paths for resistance here as a believer in Yahweh in this foreign nation that's hostile to Yahweh are pretty narrow, but he decides to go with this wise tract. He's going to go and talk to the guy who's in charge of all of the exiled kids who are there. And mind you, here he is, 12 to 14 years old, and he's the only one of the four who's brave enough to have the conversation. I think God has a special reward because of that. But not just that, think about that power dynamic. These are adults who, unlike your teachers at school, have within their rights the authority to kill you on a whim. And you're going to go ask them for a favor. And yet, we hear God softened this head steward's heart, and he was sympathetic to Daniel, and yet his math skills are still pretty good. And he says, Daniel, look at, man, if you live off of water and vegetables for the next 3 years, you're not going to look very healthy. And when you go stand before Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to wonder why you were starving to death, and he's going to blame me for it, and he understandably thinks he will probably kill me for it. Nebuchadnezzar had a great strategy for lowering his head count in his empire. It was a very literal thing, though, when he did. Now, to give you some context that'll shed some light on this as we talk about it, Nebuchadnezzar was a very violent person, and even to his advisors. Now, mind you, his advisors, these are the people who he trusts most in the world to give him direction and advice. Even to his advisors, he was known to be utterly brutal if they ever crossed him. There are multiple accounts of advisors who gave advice they shouldn't have or said things they shouldn't have, and Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and not only does he kill them, but he kills their entire family at the same time, and then as a sign to society around them, he turns their house into a giant dung heap. Literally buries it in poop, just so everybody knows this is what happened. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar, there were several historically accounted for examples of Nebuchadnezzar being angry with advisors and actually tying them to a large stake and roasting them alive over a fire. You defy him, this is well within the realm of what he's willing to do. And so you can understand for this guy why he's like, Daniel, I like you, but I'm not taking that risk, dude. That's just too much. So Daniel could give up. He could give in. The food looks really delicious, I'm sure. So there's got to be that temptation. But instead, Daniel looks for another angle on this. He prays about it. He seeks direction. He starts to find another channel by which he might be able to continue to be faithful to God. And so verses 11 through 14 will tell us that. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. So Daniel switches who he's talking to. He knows the head guy's not going to allow him to do it, but the guy who directly manages him, he goes to that guy, and he's got a different plan. I'm going to approach it differently. I'm going to mix it up after some prayer and consideration. And he says to him, look, we're here for 3 years. Give me 10 days, and for 10 days, I'll eat nothing but water and vegetables. Now, that Hebrew word for vegetables, there's some debate on that. It might include grain in that as well. So maybe you get some oatmeal with your broccoli or some bread with your broccoli. But still, not what would sound like that astounding of food. He says, let me do that for 10 days, and if I look like I'm starving to death or sickly, then, you can have your way. But if I don't, and God does a miracle, well then, maybe I could go ahead and stick with my diet plan. Now, a few good things to note with this. First of all, again, this is the least appealing option possible. But the vegetables and the grain, they haven't been sacrificed to idols, so technically, he can actually eat that. I want to point out for the record, that tells you that even demons don't like vegetables. And just incidentally, if you're curious about that. But he goes ahead, and I'll say too, some people take this passage and they use this passage as an advocation for the idea that God wants everybody to be vegetarians. And while you're welcome to have whatever dietary lifestyle you want, I'm a little more on the carnivore side of that spectrum, I will say that's not really the point here. The point is something miraculous is being offered here. Normally, if you're just living off of water and broccoli, you're not going to look as healthy as somebody who has a diverse diet, getting to eat lots of things when they want to. And so they put this fleece out there, they have this offering, and ultimately the guard who's overseeing them and who's responsible for teaching them and making sure they're doing what they're supposed to, he says, all right, Daniel, we'll roll the dice on it and we'll see what happens. I don't think this is going to work out, but at the end of 10 days, it's not 3 years anyway, at the end of 10 days, I'll just tell you, yeah, that wasn't working. Go ahead and eat your bacon, guy. All right, so continuing on with verses. Oh, I'll mention too, that food, not only was it sacrificed to idols, but a lot of it would have been unclean. So it would have been things like pork that Jewish people couldn't eat to begin with. I should have mentioned that as well. So we'll continue on, picking up at verse 15. We've only got 2 sections left. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Now we're seeing here the immediate aftermath of Daniel taking the step of faith. He isn't sure what to do, but ultimately he decides, I'm just going to take a step of faith and see if God will deliver me. If I can live and still look healthy by his miraculous power off of broccoli and bread, then that's what I'll do. It isn't going to taste as good as the barbecue, but I will do that, and I think God will meet me there. And we see here God does that. They actually look healthier than everybody else does. A miracle has occurred. And so the guard agrees. Okay, well, somehow for you guys, your genetics must be different. You're able to live off that and still look healthy, so you can continue to eat it. You don't have to defy your faith and leave it behind and go eat this idolatrous sacrificed or unclean food instead. Notice verse 17 talks about how God responds to this. There are only 4 of these young men, and yet there are thousands of young men who have been taken from Israel. And yet for these 4, God gives a special reward for this. They step out in their faith. They're bold, courageous, audacious to try to follow God in a culture that hates God. And then it says, to these men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So the 4 of them together, God stirs up this supernatural ability to understand things. Perhaps they gain eidetic memories or photographic memories overnight. We don't know, but they start memorizing all of this stuff they're learning in their master's courses that they're taking for those 3 years. They're getting way ahead of everybody else and getting an edge. God blesses them with that, not because he has to, but because he's proud of them for actually living out their faith in a culture that hates it. And on top of that, Daniel, as will be relevant in our next chapter and several going forward, Daniel also gets an additional gift. He was the one who was actually bold enough to go have the conversation and put his head on the line that way, and he's given the prophetic ability to interpret dreams and visions and stuff like that. So this is also something we'll see more relevant later. All right, so to finish out, 18 through 21. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. That last verse we're going to come back to. That's super important, actually. But here's what happens as a net effect. 3 years later, these young men have learned so much that they come to that telling day, that day that's going to define what their future in Babylon is. Are we going to dig ditches, or are we going to be in the palace? And those men have become so wise because of God's blessing, because of God's direction, that every trick question they're asked by Nebuchadnezzar and by his smartest advisors, they are showing themselves not just to be smarter than their peers, than these other 14-year-old boys around them, but also smarter than even the people who taught them. Than even the magi, that term magi that we get in the New Testament, that those are people from Babylon, it's wise men. So there's these wise men of Babylon. And I'll say too, we tend to disparage Babylon thinking this is just a stupid pagan culture, and maybe we imagine all they had to do was learn a bunch of mythology about different pagan gods. Well, that was certainly a part of what they would have learned. But again, Babylon had some very established learning when it came to agriculture, when it came to political science, when it came to chemistry, and on down the list. In fact, our hexadecimal system that we have in this world actually came from the Babylonians. The fact that when you talk about how many degrees there is in a circle and you say there's 360, or the fact that when you talk about how many minutes there are in an hour and you say 60, or how many seconds there are in a minute and there's 60, those ideas were ideas that were conceived by the Babylonian Empire. They had very sophisticated mathematical ideas and chemistry ideas, and these young men had to go and take these college-level courses for all of this stuff, and by the time they were done, again, not only were they smarter than their peers, but they were smarter than their teachers. That's how much God blessed them. And he did this because they lived out their faith in a culture that was hostile to them. Now, here we see, spoken of Daniel, and this is going to ring forward over the rest of this book and over ancient history. It says, verse 21, and Daniel remained there until the year of King Cyrus. Daniel is actually, we'll see soon in the next chapter, in fact, that Daniel is going to rise to a position of being one of the most prominent political leaders in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar, incidentally, he's going to be the longest reigning king in Babylonian history. But also, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, who will eventually take over for him and have another long reigning kingdom, Daniel will be the top advisor to him as well, in a totally different kingdom. And then, when Persia comes in about 70 years, and King Cyrus of Persia comes in and takes over Babylon, conquers it, and brings in a whole new government system, he is going to look to Daniel and again promote him to this same leading political position. Can you imagine being the top political guy in 3 different governments in your lifetime? That's pretty crazy, but that is all stuff that awaits Daniel. And it awaits Daniel because Daniel was bold in being faithful to God. I want to point out here, let's suppose there were 4,000 other Jewish teenagers who were there. There were only 4 who actually cared enough about their faith to hold true to it, to face down possible death to authority figures who could kill them, and actually live it out. That's pretty crazy. And that's why God's blessing followed these people. Now, I've got a few different pieces of direction I think we can take from this that I want to encourage you with. First of all, if you have kids, I want to ask you, how would they do if they were sent off right now? Would they hold to the faith? Or would they be enjoying a pork sandwich? Where would they be on that front? And I want to encourage you, raise kids that are like Daniel and like his friends. You have been called by God if you're a parent, and you've been called by God to raise up a leader for the next generation, to actually send somebody out to do kingdom work. And we lose sight of this nowadays. We tend to think we just want our kids to be comfortable. Well, everybody else of the 4,000 were really comfortable. But the most important people, those 4, comfort wasn't their primary concern. Doing what was right was. Being faithful to God was. And my second question is, if you were drug off there today, how would you do? Because we're getting drugged more and more that direction as time goes on. And although I'm not a prophet and I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future of America, I can tell you if you're struggling to follow God now, I'm skeptical it's going to be easier to follow him later. This is the time to be a good steward of our own heart. These 4 men did that. They followed God even when it hurt, in a culture that spat in their face for it, that literally insulted them by renaming them and enslaved them. And yet despite that, God is going to bring them to a place where they are going to change the course of the history of their nation. And in Daniel's part, prophetically, he is actually going to help us see the course of the world for thousands of years to come. All of that starts with a simple decision. God says this is the way I'm supposed to live my life, and even though my parents aren't here to tell me, I'm going to make this decision now. I'm going to live for God first and for Nebuchadnezzar after. If we did the same thing as a church, we could start to actually change this community. We could change this county. We might even change the face of this country if we would live like those young men lived. If we prioritized the things of God first and the things of this world later. At this point, I'm going to ask one of our leaders, Kent, to come forward. He's going to lead us in our time of communion and offering, and Amy will lead us in a closing song. As they come up, I'll ask you to join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, when I was 14, I wasn't even a follower of you. I definitely would have been eating a bacon cheeseburger there. But Lord, as we're here today, we pray that you would help us to have your heart for the situations we face. We don't know what tomorrow holds here in America. But I pray you'd give us boldness to live it for you, to put your values first and not the things of this world. There are so many voices crying out for our attention, so many lesser things that our hearts are trying to be filled with, and yet Lord, we pray that you'd steward our hearts, that you'd help us to be good stewards of them, to keep them on the right track, to not let poisonous influences into our life, and to focus on good things like church, like godly friends and family, and to stay with our attention on you, ready to serve, ready to change this kingdom for you and for eternity. I pray this in Jesus Christ's name, Lord. Amen.